Welcome to Fright Club. The first rule of Fright Club is you do talk about Fright Club. Based on true events. The volunteer. The call came in at 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the maples along Route 9 were just starting to turn and Jake Morrison was thinking about stopping by Dunkin Donuts for coffee that would taste like burnt water, but keep him awake for the rest of his shift. The radio crackled to life in his old Ford pickup with the authority that only emergency dispatchers possessed, a sound that could cut through sleep, conversation, or damn near anything else that passed for normal life. Millbrook Fire and Rescue. We have a 1050 with entrapment on Route 9, eastbound, approximately 2 miles past Miller's farm. Single vehicle versus tree. Driver conscious but trapped. Ambulance 3, engine 2, respond. Jake was already reaching for his radio before the dispatcher finished speaking, muscle memory from 8 years of volunteer firefighting taking over. Ambulance 3 responding, he hit the lights and siren, though on a Tuesday afternoon in rural Vermont there wasn't much traffic to get out of his way. Mostly just the occasional pickup truck or soccer mom in a Subaru who'd pull onto the shoulder with the resigned patience of people who understood that emergency vehicles had the right of way. The Morrison family had been responding to calls like this one since before Jake was born. His grandfather had been one of Millbrook's founding volunteer firefighters back in 1962, and his father had carried on the tradition until a house fire on Elm Street claimed his life when Jake was 19. Jake still remembered the funeral, remembered Chief Mackenzie's weathered hands folding the flag that had covered his father's casket, remembered promising himself that he'd carry on the family tradition of running toward the fires that everyone else ran away from. He took the curve past Miller's farm at 60, the truck's suspension protesting as he hit the frost heaves that the town never seemed to get around to fixing. The accident scene came into view about a quarter-mile ahead, a blue Honda Civic wrapped around a massive oak tree like it was trying to hug the damn thing. Jake could see smoke rising from under the crumpled hood, though not enough to suggest an immediate fire risk. The driver's side was compressed against the tree trunk, but the passenger side looked mostly intact. Jake pulled up about 50 feet from the wreck and killed the siren, though he left the emergency lights flashing. He grabbed his jump bag and headed toward the Honda, doing the quick assessment that every paramedic learned to do automatically. Scene safety, number of vehicles, number of victims, obvious hazards. The smell of radiator fluid and gasoline hung in the air, but no smoke except what was drifting up from the engine compartment. The driver was a man in his 40s, wearing a Red Sox cap and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. Conscious and alert, talking on his cell phone despite the fact that he was pinned behind the steering wheel and probably had at least a few broken ribs. Jake had seen it before. Accident victims who seemed to think that conducting normal business would somehow make the situation normal. "Sir, I'm Jake Morrison with Millbrook Fire and Rescue," Jake called out as he approached the driver's side. "I need you to hang up that phone so I can check you for injuries." The man looked up, and Jake saw the usual expression that people wore right after car accidents. Confused, slightly annoyed, as if the tree had jumped out in front of him rather than him losing control on a perfectly clear afternoon. "I'm fine," the man said, which was what they always said. "Just a little banged up. Think you can get me out of here?" Jake set his jump bag down and did a visual assessment through the spider-webbed driver's side window. The man's legs appeared to be pinned by the dashboard, and there was blood on his forehead from where he'd hit the steering wheel despite the airbag deployment. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but he'd need to be cut out with the jaws of life once Engine 2 arrived. "What's your name, sir?" Jake asked, pulling on latex gloves. "Richard Patterson. Dick. I live over on Maple Street. You probably know my wife Ellen. She works at the bank." Jake did know Ellen Patterson, had gone to school with their daughter Amy. Dick ran the hardware store in town, the kind of place where you could still buy individual screws and get advice about fixing a leaky faucet. Good people, the kind that made small towns work. "Okay, Dick, I'm going to check your vitals and see how you're doing. The fire truck's on its way with the equipment we need to get you out of there safely." Jake moved around to the passenger side where he could get closer to Dick without having to work around the tree. The passenger door was dented but not completely crushed, and he managed to pry it open with some effort. He climbed into the car and began his assessment, checking Dick's pulse, blood pressure, looking for signs of internal bleeding or serious trauma. That's when it happened. Jake was checking Dick's pupils for signs of concussion when the world suddenly shifted sideways. One moment he was looking at a man with a minor head injury and some trapped legs, and the next moment he was seeing something else entirely. Dick Patterson was on fire. Not just his clothes, his entire body was engulfed in flames that licked up from his hands and arms to consume his face and hair. The Red Sox cap was melting against his skull, and his flannel shirt was disintegrating as the fire ate through the fabric. Dick's mouth was open in a scream that Jake couldn't hear, and his hands were clawing at the flames that were devouring him from the inside out. Jake jerked backwards so hard that he cracked his head against the Honda's roof. The vision lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds, but it felt like watching a movie in slow motion. Every detail crystal clear, from the way the flames danced in Dick's eyes to the pattern of burns that spread across his hands like some kind of roadmap to hell. Then it was gone. Dick Patterson was sitting in the driver's seat, trapped but unburned, looking at Jake with concern. "You okay there, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake blinked hard, trying to clear his head. The lingering smell of smoke that he'd noticed when he first arrived at the scene seemed stronger now, though the Honda's engine had stopped smoking entirely. He took a deep breath and forced himself to focus on the real Dick Patterson, injured but stable, no signs of burns or fire damage anywhere on his body. "I'm fine," Jake said, though his hands were shaking slightly as he resumed his assessment. "Just checking to make sure you don't have a concussion. Can you tell me what day it is?" "Tuesday, September 28th. Dick's answers were clear and coherent, his pupils reactive and equal. "Look, I appreciate you checking me out, but I really am okay. Just need someone to pry me out of this mess so I can get home to Ellen." Jake continued his examination, but his mind kept returning to the vision he'd just experienced. He'd been working emergency scenes for 8 years, had seen plenty of burn victims and car fire fatalities, but he'd never hallucinated anything like that before. Maybe he was more tired than he'd realized, or maybe the stress of his father's anniversary was getting to him more than he wanted to admit. The sound of approaching sirens cut through his speculation. Engine 2 rounded the curve with Chief Mackenzie behind the wheel, followed by the town's second ambulance in case they needed additional medical support. Jake felt relieved to see the cavalry arriving, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Dick Patterson's injuries were routine, nothing that required more than basic trauma care and a controlled extrication. Chief Mackenzie was 63 years old and had been fighting fires since before Jake was born. He'd worked alongside Jake's father for 15 years and had been the one to pull Jake's dad out of the burning house on Elm Street, too late to save him, but in time to give the family a body to bury. Mackenzie had taken Jake under his wing after the funeral, teaching him everything he knew about emergency response and the sometimes brutal calculus of deciding who could be saved and who couldn't. "What do we have, Jake?" Chief Mackenzie asked as he approached the Honda with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every kind of accident the rural Vermont roads could produce. "Single occupant, conscious and alert. Vitals are stable, but he's got leg entrapment and probable rib injuries. We'll need the jaws to get him out clean." Mackenzie nodded and began organising the extrication, directing the other volunteers with the quiet authority that came from 3 decades of emergency response. Jake stepped back to let the team work, but found himself watching Dick Patterson with more attention than the situation warranted. Every few seconds he expected to see flames erupting from the man's clothing, though he couldn't explain why. The extrication took about 20 minutes, careful work with hydraulic spreaders and cutters to peel away enough of the Honda's frame to free Dick's legs without causing additional injury. Throughout the process, Dick maintained his good humour and insisted that he felt fine, though Jake could see him wince when they moved his left leg. When they finally got Dick onto a backboard and loaded into the ambulance, Jake did another complete assessment. Probable fracture of the left tibia, definitely some broken ribs, mild concussion, various cuts and bruises, nothing life-threatening, nothing that wouldn't heal with proper medical care. Dick would probably be back at the hardware store within a month, telling customers about his close call with the oak tree on Route 9. Jake was completing his paperwork when Chief Mackenzie approached the ambulance. "Good work in there, Jake. Clean extrication, patient stable. Your dad would be proud." It was the kind of thing Mackenzie said after difficult calls, a reminder that Jake was carrying on a family tradition of service. Usually it made Jake feel connected to something larger than himself, part of a line of men who dedicated their lives to helping their neighbours. Tonight it just made him think about the vision he'd had, and wonder if his father had ever seen things that weren't there. "Chief, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." Did my dad was he ever different after fire calls? Like he'd seen something that bothered him? Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face with the attention of someone trying to read between the lines. Your father was a good firefighter, Jake. One of the best I ever worked with. He had a gift for knowing where to look for victims, how to read a fire scene. Sometimes that kind of intuition can be unsettling. It wasn't really an answer, but Jake sensed that it was all he was going to get. He finished his paperwork and followed the ambulance to Millbrook Regional Hospital, where Dr. Emily Foster confirmed his diagnosis and admitted Dick Patterson for observation and surgery on his fractured leg. Nice work on the assessment, Dr. Foster said as they wheeled Dick toward the elevator. Clean immobilization, good pain management. Dick's lucky you were first on scene. Jake accepted the compliment, though he couldn't shake the feeling that luck had nothing to do with it. The vision he'd experienced in the Honda felt too specific, too detailed to be random hallucination. It was almost like he'd seen Dick Patterson's future, some terrible fate that awaited him down the road. The thought followed Jake home to his apartment above Henderson's Hardware, where he lived in 2 rooms that smelled like sawdust and motor oil from the shop below. He microwaved a frozen dinner and tried to watch the evening news, but his mind kept returning to the image of Dick Patterson burning alive in the front seat of his Honda Civic. Around 10 o'clock, Jake's radio crackled with another call. Millbrook Fire and Rescue. We have a structure fire at 247 Maple Street. Multiple units respond. 247 Maple Street. That was Dick Patterson's address. Jake grabbed his gear and ran for his truck, driving through the October night with his emergency lights cutting through the darkness. He could see the glow from 3 blocks away. Orange flames licking up from the windows of a modest 2-story house that Dick Patterson had called home for 20 years. Engine 2 was already on scene, laying out hose lines and preparing for an interior attack. Jake could see Chief Mackenzie coordinating the response, his face grim in the firelight. The house was fully involved, flames visible through every window on the first floor. "Jake!" Mackenzie shouted as Jake approached the scene. "We've got Ellen Patterson and their daughter Amy safe outside, but Dick's still in the hospital. House is a total loss, but no casualties." Jake felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Dick Patterson was safe in his hospital bed, recovering from the afternoon's car accident. But the house was burning exactly as Jake had somehow known it would, the flames consuming everything that Dick and Ellen had built together over 2 decades of marriage. As Jake helped deploy additional hose lines, he caught sight of his reflection in the window of a neighbouring house. For just a moment, the face looking back at him seemed older, more weathered, with eyes that had seen too much. It looked like his father's face, and it was smiling with the knowledge of things that hadn't happened yet. Jake Morrison went home that night with a taste of smoke in his mouth, and the growing certainty that his family's gift for firefighting was more complicated than he'd ever imagined. His father had died fighting fires, and his grandfather before him had carried secrets that he'd never shared with anyone. Now those secrets were beginning to reveal themselves to Jake, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that knowing them was going to change everything about the life he thought he understood. The photograph was waiting for him on his kitchen table when he got home, though he couldn't remember leaving it there. It showed his father in full firefighter gear, standing next to a man Jake didn't recognize. Both men were covered in soot and ash, but they were smiling with the satisfaction of a job well done. On the back, in his father's careful handwriting, 3 generations of flame keepers, the Morrison legacy. Jake stared at the photograph until his eyes burned, wondering who the 3rd generation was supposed to be, and what exactly his family had been keeping all these years. The call came at 8:23 on a Thursday morning in early October, when Jake Morrison was finishing his 2nd cup of coffee and trying to convince himself that the strange dreams he'd been having about burning houses were just his subconscious processing the Patterson fire. He'd been off duty for 3 days, spending his time doing odd jobs around town and avoiding the firehouse, though he couldn't exactly explain why he felt the need to stay away. Millbrook Fire and Rescue. We have a medical emergency at Millbrook Elementary. Possible allergic reaction, child unconscious. Ambulance 3, respond. Jake was reaching for his keys before the dispatcher finished speaking, though something cold settled in his stomach at the mention of the elementary school. He'd graduated from Millbrook Elementary 21 years ago, back when Mrs. Henderson was still teaching 3rd grade and the playground equipment was wooden instead of the modern plastic jungle gyms they had now. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where serious emergencies were rare enough to draw crowds of worried parents. The drive to the school took 6 minutes, long enough for Jake to run through the possible scenarios in his head. Allergic reactions in kids were usually food-related, someone's lunch containing something they shouldn't have, or maybe a bee sting during outdoor recess. Quick epinephrine shot, transport to the hospital, kid would probably be fine within an hour or two. The elementary school was a low brick building that had been constructed in the 1960s, when the town was growing and people still believed that rural Vermont would continue to attract young families. Now the enrollment was half what it had been during Jake's childhood, but the building still maintained the institutional cheerfulness that elementary schools required. Bright bulletin boards, construction paper cutouts, that particular smell of cleaning supplies and crayons that probably existed in every elementary school in America. Jake found the emergency in Mrs. Thompson's second-grade classroom, where a 7-year-old boy named Timothy Walsh was lying on the floor in obvious respiratory distress. His lips were blue, his breathing was shallow and rapid, and the classic hives of an allergic reaction were spreading across his neck and arms. Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her 50s who had been teaching at Millbrook Elementary since Jake was a student, was kneeling beside Timothy with the controlled panic that teachers developed when one of their kids was seriously hurt. He was eating his lunch, Mrs. Thompson explained as Jake knelt beside Timothy and began his assessment. Peanut butter and jelly sandwich just like always, then suddenly he started wheezing and couldn't catch his breath. Jake checked Timothy's pulse, rapid and thready, and listened to his lungs with his stethoscope. Severe bronchospasm, probably anaphylactic shock from a food allergy that had either developed recently or never been properly diagnosed. The kid needed epinephrine immediately, followed by transport to the hospital for observation and additional treatment. "Timothy, can you hear me?" Jake asked as he prepared the epinephrine auto-injector. "I'm going to give you some medicine that's going to help you breathe better." Timothy's eyes were wide with the fear that came with not being able to get enough air, but he managed a weak nod. Jake administered the epinephrine injection into the boy's thigh, then positioned him to optimize his breathing while they waited for the medication to take effect. That's when the vision hit him. Jake was checking Timothy's blood pressure when the classroom suddenly shifted around him. The bright bulletin boards became scorched and peeling. The cheerful alphabet posters curled and blackened at the edges. The smell of crayons and cleaning supplies was replaced by the acrid stench of burning paper and melting plastic. And Mrs. Thompson was on fire. She stood in the same position where she'd been watching Jake treat Timothy, but now flames were consuming her floral print dress and climbing up her grey hair like living things. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and her hands were clawing at the fire that was eating through her skin. The flames weren't random. They followed specific patterns across her body, concentrated on her hands and face, spreading from there to engulf her entirely. Behind her, the classroom window showed not the school playground, but a hellscape of orange flame and black smoke. Books were burning on their shelves, children's artwork was curling into ash, and the classroom door was blocked by debris that glowed red hot. The vision lasted maybe 5 seconds, but Jake experienced every detail with crystalline clarity. The way Mrs. Thompson's wedding ring melted against her finger, the pattern of burns that spread across her cheeks like some kind of obscene tattoo, the sound of her burning hair crackling in the superheated air. Then it was gone. Jake found himself kneeling beside Timothy Walsh in a perfectly normal second-grade classroom, with Mrs. Thompson watching anxiously as the epinephrine began to improve the boy's breathing. The bulletin boards were bright and cheerful, the windows showed the familiar playground, and the only smell was the lingering antiseptic scent of the medication Jake had just administered. "Is he going to be okay?" Mrs. Thompson asked, and Jake noticed that her voice was perfectly normal, no trace of the agony he'd seen in his vision. "He's responding well to the epinephrine," Jake said, though his own voice sounded strained to his ears. "We'll transport him to the hospital for observation, but he should make a full recovery." Timothy's breathing was already improving, the blue tinge fading from his lips as the medication opened his airways. Jake completed his assessment and prepared the boy for transport, but he couldn't stop glancing at Mrs. Thompson, looking for some sign of the burns he'd seen consuming her in his vision. She looked exactly like she always had. A middle-aged teacher in a floral print dress, concerned about one of her students but otherwise completely normal. No burns, no signs of injury, no indication that she would ever come into contact with fire. But Jake had learned not to trust that initial impression. During the transport to Millbrook Regional Hospital, Timothy continued to improve under Jake's care. By the time they reached the emergency department, the boy was breathing normally and asking for his mother, who met them at the hospital entrance with the tearful relief that parents showed when their child's medical emergency turned out to be manageable. Dr. Emily Foster was working the emergency department that morning, and she took over Timothy's care with the competent efficiency that had made her Jake's favourite physician to work with. Emily was 34, had moved to Millbrook 2 years ago from Boston to escape the chaos of urban emergency medicine, and had the kind of practical intelligence that made her an excellent rural doctor. "Nice work on the allergic reaction," Emily told Jake as they watched Timothy reunite with his parents. "Quick recognition, proper treatment. The kid's lucky you got there when you did." "Just following protocol," Jake said, though he found himself studying Emily's face for any sign of the burns he'd seen in previous visions. She looked healthy and uninjured, but so had Dick Patterson right before his house burned down. "Jake, are you feeling okay? You look a little pale." "Fine, just tired. It's been a busy week." Emily gave him the appraising look that medical professionals used when they suspected someone wasn't telling them the whole truth. "When's the last time you took some time off? Real time off, not just a couple of days between calls?" Jake couldn't remember. The volunteer fire department was always short-staffed, and he'd gotten into the habit of being available for every call, partly out of dedication, and partly because he didn't have much else to fill his time. His ex-girlfriend Lisa had moved to Burlington 6 months ago, citing his obsession with emergency response work as one of the reasons their relationship hadn't worked out. "I'm fine, Emily, just need more coffee." But as Jake drove back to town, he couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Thompson burning in her classroom. The vision had been just as detailed and specific as the one he'd experienced with Dick Patterson, right down to the pattern of burns and the way the flames had consumed her clothing. 2 days later, Jake was grocery shopping at Miller's Market when the call came in over his radio. "Millbrook Fire and Rescue. We have a structure fire at Millbrook Elementary School. Multiple units respond." Jake dropped his shopping cart in the frozen foods aisle and ran for his truck, driving toward the school with a sick certainty about what he would find. The smoke was visible from 3 blocks away, a black column rising from the direction of the elementary school against the crisp October sky. Engine 2 was already on scene when Jake arrived, along with mutual aid companies from 2 neighbouring towns. The fire was concentrated in the building's eastern wing, where the second-grade classrooms were located. Jake could see flames through the windows of Mrs. Thompson's classroom, the same orange glow he'd seen in his vision 3 days earlier. Chief Mackenzie was coordinating the response from the parking lot, directing crews as they laid out hose lines and prepared for an interior attack. The building had been evacuated successfully. Jake could see clusters of children and teachers gathered in the playground area, all accounted for and safe, all except Mrs. Thompson. "She went back inside," Mackenzie told Jake grimly. "Said she forgot something in her classroom that was 10 minutes ago, before the smoke got too heavy." Jake looked at the burning building and saw exactly what his vision had shown him. Flames consuming the eastern wing, Mrs. Thompson trapped somewhere inside, probably overcome by smoke and heat. The same pattern of destruction that he'd seen in his mind 3 days ago, playing out in real time. "I'm going in," Jake said, already moving toward his gear. "Negative. Interior attack team is suiting up now. Too dangerous for paramedic entry." But Jake was already pulling on his turnout coat and helmet, grabbing an air pack from Engine 2. He'd completed firefighter training along with his paramedic certification, though he usually stayed outside to handle medical emergencies. Tonight felt different. Tonight he knew exactly where Mrs. Thompson would be and what condition she'd be in when they found her. "Jake," I said. "Negative," Mackenzie called, but Jake was already moving toward the building entrance. The interior of the elementary school was a maze of smoke and heat, filled with the sounds of burning wood and the distant roar of flames consuming everything they touched. Jake moved through the hallways by memory and instinct, following the route to Mrs. Thompson's classroom that he'd walked as a 7-year-old student. He found her exactly where his vision had predicted, collapsed beside her desk, overcome by smoke inhalation but still alive. She was unconscious but breathing, her pulse weak but steady. No burns yet, though the flames were getting closer and the smoke was getting thicker. Jake lifted Mrs. Thompson in a fireman's carry and made his way back through the smoke-filled hallways, following the hose lines that the interior attack team had deployed. By the time he emerged from the building, Mrs. Thompson was starting to regain consciousness, coughing up the smoke she'd inhaled but otherwise uninjured. "How did you know where to find her?" Chief Mackenzie asked as Jake handed Mrs. Thompson over to the medical team. Jake didn't have an answer that would make sense to anyone else. How could he explain that he'd seen her burning to death 3 days before the fire actually started? How could he describe visions that seemed to show the future with perfect accuracy? "Lucky guess," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. Mrs. Thompson recovered completely from her smoke inhalation and returned to teaching the following week. The elementary school's eastern wing was rebuilt over the summer, with modern fire suppression systems and additional safety features. Everyone agreed that the emergency response had been textbook perfect, with no fatalities and minimal property damage. But Jake Morrison went home that night knowing that his family's legacy was more complicated than emergency response training and community service. The visions were becoming more frequent and more detailed, showing him disasters that hadn't happened yet but somehow would. Each vision felt like a warning, a chance to prevent tragedy, but also like a curse that he couldn't escape. He started keeping a journal, documenting each vision and its eventual outcome. Dick Patterson's house fire, Mrs. Thompson's classroom blaze, both exactly as he'd seen them in his mind, playing out with the inevitability of prophecy. The journal also documented the physical changes Jake was beginning to notice in himself. A persistent low-grade fever that never quite went away, burn marks on his palms that appeared overnight and faded by morning, the taste of smoke in his mouth even when he hadn't been near a fire, and the dreams. Every night now, Jake dreamed of flames and burning buildings, of people trapped in infernos that consumed everything around them. In the dreams, he could walk through fire without being hurt, could see through smoke as if it were clear air, could hear the voices of the trapped and injured calling for help. In the dreams, he looked like his father. Jake had started avoiding mirrors because sometimes his reflection showed someone older, more weathered, with eyes that had seen too much fire and death. It was the face of a man who carried secrets that couldn't be shared with anyone who hadn't earned the right to know them. 3 weeks after the elementary school fire, Jake was finishing his shift at the firehouse when Chief Mackenzie approached him with a manila folder and the serious expression that meant they needed to talk about something important. "Jake, I think it's time you learned some things about your family," Mackenzie said, setting the folder on the table between them. "Things your father never got the chance to tell you." Inside the folder were photographs that Jake had never seen before. His father and grandfather in firefighter gear, standing beside burning buildings with expressions of grim satisfaction. Medical records showing that Morrison men tended to die young, usually from unexplained internal injuries that resembled severe burns. Newspaper clippings about fires that had been fought with miraculous success. Disasters where the casualties were far lower than they should have been. And at the bottom of the pile, a handwritten letter in his father's careful script. "If you're reading this, then the gift has manifested in you the way it did in me and my father before me. The Morrison family has been keeping the flame for 3 generations now, and I'm sorry to say that the responsibility has fallen to you. The visions will get stronger and more frequent. The physical changes will accelerate. You'll start to burn from the inside out, just like we all do. But you'll also save lives that no one else could save, prevent tragedies that would have consumed entire families. It's a hard burden to carry, son, but it's our burden. Use the gift wisely and try to live with the cost." Jake read the letter 3 times before looking up at Chief Mackenzie, who was watching him with the patience of someone who had been carrying secrets for a very long time. "How long have you known?" Jake asked. "Since your father died." "Since my father worked with your grandfather and told me stories that I didn't believe until I saw your dad walk through a house fire that should have killed him." Mackenzie leaned back in his chair. "The Morrison family has a gift, Jake, but gifts like that always come with a price." Jake thought about the visions, about the growing heat he felt inside his own body, about the way his reflection sometimes showed him burning from within. He thought about Mrs. Thompson, alive and teaching, because he'd known exactly where to find her in a smoke-filled building. "What's the price?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The same price your father paid," Mackenzie said quietly. "The same one his father paid before him. The flame that lets you see the future, that lets you walk through fire and save lives that can't be saved any other way, eventually it burns you up from the inside. Morrison men don't live to see their 40th birthday. Jake Morrison was 32 years old. He had 7 years left, maybe 8 if he was lucky. 7 years to use a gift he was only beginning to understand, to save lives that would otherwise be lost, to carry on a family tradition that had been killing Morrison men for 3 generations. 7 years to burn bright enough to make the sacrifice worthwhile. The house fire on Elm Street started at 2:17 a.m. on a November night, when Jake Morrison should have been sleeping off a double shift, but instead found himself sitting at his kitchen table, reading his father's letter for the 20th time, and trying to understand what it meant to carry the flame. The radio call came through with a flat urgency that only structure fires generated, cutting through the silence of his apartment like a knife through paper. Millbrook Fire and Rescue. We have a working structure fire at 428 Elm Street. Possible entrapment. All units respond. Jake was pulling on his turnout gear before the dispatcher finished speaking, though something cold and familiar was settling in his stomach. He'd had the vision 3 days ago. A woman in her 60s trapped in a back bedroom while flames consumed the first floor of a 2-story colonial. He'd seen her face clearly in the vision, seen the exact burns that would mark her hands and arms, seen the pattern of smoke damage that would scar her lungs. Mrs. Helen Crawford, who lived alone since her husband died 2 years ago and kept cats that the neighbours complained about. Jake had known Helen since childhood. She'd been his 3rd grade teacher, the kind of strict but fair woman who made sure her students learned proper grammar and basic arithmetic, whether they wanted to or not. The drive to Elm Street took 4 minutes, long enough for Jake to run through what he knew would happen. Helen would be unconscious from smoke inhalation when they found her, trapped in the back bedroom by debris that had fallen across the doorway. She'd have 2nd-degree burns on her hands from trying to move a burning dresser, and her left arm would be broken from falling when the smoke overwhelmed her. All of this Jake knew with the same certainty that he knew his own name, because he'd seen it happening in his mind 3 days ago, while treating a minor fender bender on Route 9. The Colonial on Elm Street was fully involved when Jake arrived, flames visible through every window on the 1st floor and beginning to work their way up to the 2nd story. Engine 2 was already on scene with Chief Mackenzie coordinating the response, laying out hose lines and preparing for an interior attack. The structure was old enough that it would burn fast and hot, with balloon frame construction that let fire travel through the walls like it was following a highway. "Jake," Mackenzie called as Jake approached the command post. "We've got possible entrapment in the back bedroom, 2nd floor. Neighbour says Helen Crawford lives alone, but her car's in the driveway." Jake nodded, though he was already moving toward his gear. He knew exactly where Helen would be and what condition she'd be in when they found her. The question was whether he could reach her in time, whether his knowledge of what was coming would be enough to change the outcome. "I'm going in," Jake said, pulling on his airpack and checking his radio. "Negative. Wait for the interior attack team to..." "Chief, she's in the back bedroom, unconscious from smoke inhalation. Left arm broken from a fall, 2nd-degree burns on both hands. Doorways blocked by a fallen dresser." Jake looked directly at Mackenzie. "I know where she is." Mackenzie stared at him for a long moment, and Jake saw recognition flicker in the older man's eyes. Recognition, and something that might have been resignation. "5 minutes, Mackenzie said finally. "You get 5 minutes, then I'm sending a team in after you." Jake entered the burning house through the front door, following the hallway that led to the main staircase. The interior was a maze of smoke and superheated air, filled with the sound of burning wood and the distant roar of flames consuming everything they touched. But Jake moved through it with confidence that surprised him, as if he'd walked these halls 100 times before. The staircase was still intact, though he could feel the heat radiating through the walls as the fire worked its way up from below. The 2nd floor was thick with smoke but not yet fully involved, giving him a narrow window to reach Helen before the flames cut off his escape route. He found her exactly where his vision had predicted, collapsed beside her bed, unconscious but still breathing. The fallen dresser blocked the doorway just as he'd seen, and Helen's hands showed the burns he'd known would be there. Her left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, where she'd fallen trying to escape the smoke. Jake moved the dresser with strength that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself, lifting furniture that should have required 2 men to move. He gathered Helen in his arms and made his way back through the smoke-filled hallway. following the sound of the interior attack team that was finally making their way up the stairs. By the time Jake emerged from the burning house, Helen Crawford was conscious and asking for her cats. She had exactly the injuries he'd foreseen: smoke inhalation, burns on both hands, broken left arm. But she was alive and would make a full recovery within 6 weeks. "How did you know exactly where to find her?" Mackenzie asked as Jake handed Helen over to the medical team. Jake didn't answer directly. How could he explain that he'd seen her death 3 days before the fire started? That he'd watched her burn in his mind while treating a completely unrelated emergency call? "Lucky guess," Jake said, though the words felt like a lie even as he spoke them. But luck had nothing to do with it, and both Jake and Chief Mackenzie knew it. Over the following weeks, Jake began to understand the scope of what was happening to him. The visions were becoming more frequent and more detailed, showing him disasters that would occur days or even weeks in the future. A kitchen fire that would trap the Kellys' teenage daughter unless Jake convinced them to install smoke detectors in every room. A propane explosion at the high school that could be prevented by reporting a gas leak that hadn't started yet. Each vision came with perfect clarity and devastating specificity. Jake could see the exact location of victims, the precise nature of their injuries, the way flames would move through structures and consume everything in their path. More disturbing, he was beginning to realize that his presence at emergency scenes might be triggering the future disasters he was seeing. The pattern was becoming clear. Jake would respond to a routine call, have a vision of someone burning, then days later that exact fire would occur. It was as if his supernatural sight was somehow connected to the fires themselves, as if seeing them was what allowed them to happen. To test this theory, Jake began avoiding certain calls, making excuses to stay away from scenes where he'd had particularly vivid visions. The results were both encouraging and terrifying. When Jake didn't respond to the Palmer Farm accident, their barn didn't catch fire 3 days later as he'd foreseen. When he skipped the medical emergency at the grocery store, the electrical fire that should have started in the break room never materialized. But avoiding the calls came with its own cost. Jake started receiving reports of increased casualties at fires where he wasn't present, higher rates of fatalities when other paramedics handled victims he'd seen burning in his visions. It was as if his absence allowed the fires to burn hotter and more destructively, claiming lives that his supernatural gift might have saved. The moral calculus was brutal and simple. Jake's visions might be causing the fires, but his presence at those fires was also the only thing that kept them from becoming disasters. He was both the disease and the cure, the person who brought destruction, and the only one capable of limiting its impact. Jake was struggling with this realization when Chief Mackenzie called him into the firehouse office on a cold December morning, closing the door behind them with the deliberate care of someone who needed to discuss matters that couldn't be overheard. "Your father went through this same phase," Mackenzie said without preamble. "The guilt, the testing, the trying to avoid calls to prevent the fires from happening. Did it work? Could he prevent them? For a while, but the cost was too high." Mackenzie pulled out a manila folder that Jake recognized, the same one that had contained his father's letter and the family photographs. "Morrison men don't cause the fires, Jake. You carry something that lets you see them coming, but the fires happen whether you're there or not. The difference is how many people die." Mackenzie opened the folder and showed Jake a newspaper clipping from 15 years ago, before Jake's father died. The headline read, "Apartment fire claims 7 lives. Emergency response delayed." "Your father tried avoiding calls for 2 months. During that time, 3 major fires occurred in the county. 21 people died who might have lived if he'd been there to guide the rescue efforts." Mackenzie's voice was grim. "After that, he never missed another call until the night he died." Jake studied the newspaper clipping, reading about families who had perished in fires that his father might have prevented. Children who had suffocated in smoke-filled bedrooms that could have been reached if someone had known exactly where to look. Elderly residents who had burned to death because their rescuers couldn't find them in time. What about the physical cost? Dad's letter mentioned burning from the inside out. Mackenzie rolled up his sleeves, revealing scars that looked like burn marks running up his forearms. "I'm not a Morrison, but I worked closely enough with your father and grandfather to pick up some of the effects. The flame spirit doesn't just choose one person per generation. It needs allies, people who can support the main carrier. Flame spirit? That's what your grandfather called it. Something old, something that feeds on fire and smoke and the life force of people who die in blazes. But it's not entirely malevolent. It seems to have developed a symbiotic relationship with your family. It shows Morrison men where the fires will be in exchange for access. Access to what? To the fire itself. To the energy that's released when buildings burn and people die. Your family serves as conduits, allowing the spirit to experience fires directly while using your knowledge to limit the casualties. Mackenzie closed the folder. It's not a comfortable arrangement, but it's kept a lot of people alive over the past 60 years. Jake thought about the visions, about the way he'd been able to walk through smoke and flame without injury, about the growing heat he felt inside his own body. And the cost is our lives. Eventually, the flame spirit burns through Morrison men like fuel. Your grandfather lasted until 38. Your father made it to 39. The question is how you want to spend the time you have left. Jake was 32. He had 6 years, maybe 7 if he was exceptionally lucky. 6 years to use a gift that would ultimately consume him, to save lives while the thing inside him slowly burned away his own life force. That night, Jake sat in his apartment and made a list of everyone he'd saved since the vision started. Dick Patterson, who would have burned to death in his house if Jake hadn't known to check on him after the car accident. Mrs. Thompson, who would have died of smoke inhalation in her classroom if Jake hadn't known exactly where to find her. Helen Crawford, who would have suffocated in her back bedroom if Jake hadn't been able to move the fallen dresser. 3 lives saved in 2 months, with the certain knowledge that more fires were coming, more people who would need rescue from disasters that only Jake could foresee. Against that, he weighed his own mortality. 6 years of life, probably spent in increasing pain as the flame spirit consumed him from within. 6 years of visions that would show him death and destruction before they happened. 6 years of carrying secrets that he couldn't share with anyone who hadn't earned the right to know them. It wasn't much of a choice when he thought about it clearly. Jake Morrison was a firefighter because his father had been a firefighter, because his grandfather had been a firefighter, because the Morrison family had been running toward fires when everyone else ran away for 3 generations. The supernatural aspect just meant that he'd be more effective at it, able to save lives that would otherwise be lost. The cost was his own life, but Jake had always known that firefighting was dangerous work. Men died fighting fires every year, killed by collapsing roofs and backdrafts and smoke inhalation. At least this way, his death would have meaning beyond simple bad luck or occupational hazard. Jake closed his notebook and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new emergency calls and probably new visions. The flame spirit was still growing stronger inside him, still showing him disasters that hadn't happened yet. Each vision brought him closer to understanding the full scope of his inherited burden, and closer to the fire that would eventually consume him. But tonight, 3 people were alive who wouldn't have been without his intervention. Tomorrow, there might be more. That had to be enough because it was all the Morrison family had ever been able to offer. Their lives in exchange for the lives of others, 1 generation at a time, burning bright enough to light the way through disasters that would otherwise claim everyone they touched. Jake Morrison slept that night, and dreamed of flames that danced with the voices of his father and grandfather, welcoming him to a tradition that was older than Millbrook itself, and would continue long after he was gone. The vision came to Jake Morrison at 3:33 a.m. on a January night when the temperature had dropped to 15 below, and the whole world seemed frozen solid. He'd been dreaming of flames again, the same recurring nightmare where he walked through burning buildings while voices called his name from rooms that were always just out of reach. But this vision was different from the dreams, sharper and more immediate, cutting through his sleep like a blade through ice. He saw the Riverside apartments on fire. Not just a small kitchen fire or an electrical problem, the entire 4-story building engulfed in flames that reached into the winter sky like grasping fingers. Jake could see every detail with the crystalline clarity that had become familiar over the past 4 months. The way the fire would start in the basement utility room, how it would race up through the building's old ventilation system, which apartments would be cut off from the stairwells and which residents would have time to escape. Most disturbing of all, he could see himself in the vision, walking through the burning hallways with supernatural confidence while the building collapsed around him. He watched himself enter apartments where normal firefighters couldn't go, saw himself emerge from flames that should have reduced him to ash, carrying victims who would die without his intervention. But he also saw the price. In the vision, Jake emerged from the Riverside apartments with burns covering 70% of his body, his face a mask of charred flesh, his hands blackened claws that could no longer hold equipment or comfort victims. The flame spirit was consuming him visibly now, turning him into something that was more fire than human. Jake woke with a taste of smoke in his mouth and the absolute certainty that the vision would become reality within 48 hours. He spent the next day trying to function normally, responding to routine calls and maintaining the facade of a firefighter who wasn't slowly burning to death from the inside out. But the vision hung over him like storm clouds, impossible to ignore or forget. By evening, Jake could feel the heat building in his chest, the flame spirit growing restless in anticipation of the fire to come. Dr. Bjerre, Emily Foster noticed the change when Jake brought in a patient from a minor car accident that afternoon. She cornered him in the hospital break room with the direct approach that had made her an effective emergency physician. "Jake, you look terrible. When's the last time you slept? Really slept, not just passing out between calls?" Jake studied his reflection in the break room's coffee pot and saw what Emily was seeing. Dark circles under his eyes, a greyish pallor to his skin, and something feverish in his expression that suggested illness or exhaustion. The burn marks on his hands were more visible now, raising patterns across his palms that looked like ritual scarification. "I'm fine, Emily, just tired." "You're not fine. You look like you're running a fever, and those marks on your hands..." She reached for his wrist, but Jake pulled away before she could examine the burns. "Jake, as a medical professional and someone who cares about you, I'm concerned. When did those burns appear?" Jake couldn't tell her the truth, that the burns appeared every time he used his supernatural gift, that they were marks left by the flame spirit as it slowly consumed him from within. Emily was a rational person who believed in medical explanations and scientific solutions. She wouldn't understand that some conditions couldn't be treated with antibiotics or surgery. Old injuries from firefighting. Those aren't old injuries, they're fresh, and they're getting worse. Emily's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years distinguishing between routine medical issues and genuine emergencies. "I want to run some tests, check your blood work, maybe get a dermatology consult. No tests." Jake stood up abruptly, needing to end this conversation before Emily uncovered something that couldn't be explained by conventional medicine. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine, Jake." But he was already walking away, leaving Emily standing in the break room with the frustrated expression of a doctor whose patient refused treatment for an obvious medical condition. That night, Jake sat in his apartment and wrote letters that he hoped would never need to be delivered. To Chief Mackenzie, explaining the full extent of what he'd learned about the Morrison family gift and the responsibilities that came with it. To Emily, apologising for his deception and asking her to understand that some burdens couldn't be shared with people who hadn't inherited them. To his sister Sarah in California, telling her about their father's real legacy and warning her to watch for signs of the gift manifesting in her own children. The letters felt like a farewell, though Jake told himself he was just being prudent. The vision of the Riverside apartments had shown him surviving the fire, even if the cost was higher than anything he'd paid before. He would live through tomorrow night, but he might not be recognisably human afterward. At 11:47 p.m. on Friday, Jake's radio crackled with the call he'd been expecting. "Millbrook Fire and Rescue. We have a working structure fire at the Riverside Apartments, 412 River Street. Multiple residents reported trapped. All units respond." Jake was in his truck and moving before the dispatcher finished speaking, though something felt different this time. The flame spirit inside him was more active than it had ever been, filling his chest with heat that had nothing to do with external temperature. He could feel it preparing for the fire ahead, gathering strength for what would be either its greatest triumph or its final manifestation. The Riverside Apartments were a converted factory building from the 1920s, 4 stories of brick and timber construction that housed about 60 residents in small efficiency units. When Jake arrived, the building was already fully involved, with flames visible through windows on every floor and smoke pouring from the roof like a volcanic eruption. Chief Mackenzie was coordinating the response from across the street, directing multiple engine companies and calling for additional mutual aid from neighbouring towns. The building's age and construction made it a firefighter's nightmare. Balloon frame walls that let fire travel vertically, narrow hallways that became death traps filled with smoke, and a single stairwell that was already compromised. "Jake!" Mackenzie called as Jake approached the command post. "We've got multiple residents unaccounted for. Building's too far gone for interior attack, but we can hear people calling for help from the upper floors." Jake looked at the burning building and saw exactly what his vision had shown him. Flames consuming the structure from bottom to top, residents trapped in apartments that conventional rescue techniques couldn't reach. The external fire escapes had already been compromised by heat and structural damage, and the aerial ladders couldn't extend high enough to reach the 4th floor. "I'm going in," Jake said, already moving toward his gear. "Negative. Building's unstable. Interior attack is not viable. We're setting up exterior defensive operations. Chief, there are people up there who are going to die if someone doesn't reach them in the next 10 minutes. Jake pulled on his turnout coat and airpack with movements that felt automatic, driven by something deeper than conscious decision. "I know where they are." Mackenzie grabbed Jake's arm, and for the first time since Jake had known him, the chief looked genuinely afraid. "Jake, I've seen what this gift does to Morrison men. Your father walked into a fire that killed him because he thought he could save everyone. Don't make the same mistake." "This isn't a mistake." Jake could feel the flame spirit moving through his body like liquid fire, preparing him for what was coming. "This is what I was born to do." Jake walked toward the burning building while Chief Mackenzie shouted orders behind him, calling for additional resources and preparing medical teams for the casualties that would emerge from the fire. But Jake was beyond hearing conventional emergency response protocols. The flame spirit was guiding him now, showing him paths through the burning building that no normal person could survive. The interior of the riverside apartments was a hellscape of superheated air and toxic smoke, filled with the sounds of collapsing timber and the distant screams of trapped residents. Jake moved through it with confidence that belonged to something other than human training or experience. The flames parted around him like water, and the smoke seemed to clear wherever he walked. On the 2nd floor he found the Hendersons, an elderly couple trapped in their apartment by debris that had fallen across their doorway. Jake moved the burning timber with strength that shouldn't have been possible, lifting beams that weighed hundreds of pounds and were glowing red hot. The Hendersons were unconscious from smoke inhalation but alive, and Jake carried them through the flame-filled hallway to the stairwell that was somehow still passable. On the 3rd floor he found Maria Santos and her 2 young children cowering in a bathroom, while fire consumed the rest of their apartment. The children were crying with a pure terror that only the very young experienced when faced with death, but they stopped crying when Jake appeared in the doorway. He looked like something from a dream or nightmare, a figure wreathed in flames that didn't burn him, moving through destruction with supernatural grace. "It's okay," Jake told the children as he gathered them in his arms. "We're going home now." He carried Maria and her children through hallways that were completely engulfed, past walls that were collapsing and floors that were giving way beneath his feet. The flame spirit was fully manifested now, surrounding Jake with fire that protected him while consuming everything else in its path. On the 4th floor, Jake found what he'd been looking for, the confrontation that his vision had predicted. In the center of what had once been the building's common area, the flame spirit appeared to him directly for the first time. It looked like a man made of fire, tall and imposing, with features that shifted between Jake's father and grandfather, and faces he didn't recognize but somehow knew belonged to previous generations of Morrison men. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of burning timber and collapsing walls. "You have served well," the flame spirit said. 3 generations of faithful service, 3 generations of men who chose duty over life. The pattern is complete. What pattern? The awakening. For 60 years, Morrison men have served as conduits, allowing me to experience fire and rescue directly, while using your knowledge to limit casualties. But the relationship was always meant to evolve. Jake found himself standing in a circle of flames that didn't burn him, surrounded by destruction that somehow felt sacred rather than terrifying. Evolve how? "You're the last Morrison who will burn out and die from carrying me. Tonight you become something more, a permanent bridge between the world of flame and the world of flesh. You will no longer age or sicken or tire. You will be able to walk through any fire, save any life, prevent any tragedy that flame might cause. And the cost? You stop being entirely human. You become something between man and fire, serving as my permanent avatar in the physical world. The flame spirit stepped closer, and Jake could feel heat that went beyond temperature, beyond physical sensation. Your family, your relationships, your life as Jake Morrison, all of that ends tonight, but your service continues forever. Jake thought about Emily Foster waiting for him to explain the burns on his hands, about Chief Mackenzie and the volunteer fire department that had become his family, about the normal life he'd never really had but had always imagined he might find someday. Against that, he weighed the lives he could save, not just tonight, but for decades to come. Every fire that would ever threaten Millbrook or the surrounding communities, every person who would ever be trapped in burning buildings, every family that would face the choice between escape and staying behind to help others. There's another option, Jake said. I can refuse, walk away from all of this, and let someone else carry the burden. Yes, but then Maria Santos and her children die tonight, along with 6 other residents who are trapped on this floor, and tomorrow, when the next fire comes, those victims die as well, and the day after that, and the day after that. The flame spirit gestured toward the burning building around them. Without a Morrison to guide rescues, this fire kills 15 people instead of none. Without someone who can see disasters before they happen, dozens of families lose everything they've built together. Jake looked through the flames and saw the truth of what the spirit was offering. He could see the future spreading out before him like a map. Every fire that would threaten the community over the next 50 years, every life that would be lost without supernatural intervention, every tragedy that could be prevented by someone willing to sacrifice their humanity for the greater good. It wasn't really a choice at all. I accept, Jake said. The transformation began immediately. Jake felt the flame spirit flow into him completely, not just residing in his chest, but becoming part of every cell in his body. His human limitations burned away, the need for sleep, the vulnerability to heat and smoke, the fear of death that had always driven his courage. In their place came something larger and more terrible, the certain knowledge that he would never die, never rest, never be free from the responsibility of standing between his community and the fires that would consume them. When Jake emerged from the Riverside apartments carrying the last of the trapped residents, Chief Mackenzie barely recognized him. The burns that covered his body weren't wounds. They were marks of transformation, patterns of fire that moved beneath his skin like living tattoos. His eyes held flames that never went out, and when he spoke, his voice carried the sound of distant combustion. Everyone's accounted for, Jake said, setting down Mrs. Chen and her infant daughter. Building's clear. Jake, what happened to you in there? Jake looked at his hands, seeing the flames that danced just beneath the surface of his skin. He would never again touch another person without the risk of burning them. Never again sleep peacefully without dreaming of fires that hadn't happened yet. Never again be fully human. But 15 people were alive who would have died without his intervention. Tomorrow there would be more. I became what I needed to become, Jake said, and walked away from the fire scene while the Riverside apartments collapsed behind him in a controlled burn that would leave no evidence of the supernatural rescue that had taken place within its walls. Jake Morrison, the man, had died in that fire. What emerged was something else, a guardian made of flame and flesh, bound to protect his community for as long as fires threatened to consume the innocent. The Morrison legacy would continue, but it would no longer require the death of those who carried it. Jake had paid that price for all future generations, burning away his humanity so that others could live safely in the warmth of their homes, never knowing how close they came to disaster every day. 6 months after the Riverside Apartments fire, Jake Morrison stood in the parking lot of Millbrook Regional Hospital, watching smoke rise from the building's east wing like a pillar of black judgment against the morning sky. The vision had come to him 3 days ago while he was replacing smoke detectors in the elementary school. A flash of destruction so complete and devastating that he dropped his tools and stood paralyzed for nearly 5 minutes while Mrs. Thompson asked if he was feeling all right. Now the vision was becoming reality, and Jake knew with absolute certainty that this would be the fire that finally consumed him entirely. He'd changed since the Riverside incident, though he'd tried to hide the transformation from those who cared about him. The flame spirit had made him stronger, faster, more resilient to heat and smoke, but it had also made him less human with each passing day. His body temperature ran consistently at 102 degrees, hot enough that he couldn't touch other people without causing them discomfort. His eyes held flickers of fire that became more pronounced when he was agitated or excited. Most disturbing of all, he could feel the flame spirit growing hungrier, demanding more frequent and more dangerous fires to satisfy its supernatural appetite. The hospital fire would be different from everything that had come before. Jake's vision had shown him dozens of victims trapped throughout the building's 4 floors, patients who couldn't be moved quickly, medical staff who wouldn't abandon their charges, visitors who had no escape route from the maze of corridors that would become death traps filled with toxic smoke. But the vision had also shown him the price of saving them all, to reach every victim, to guide every rescue. To prevent the catastrophic loss of life that would otherwise occur, Jake would have to merge completely with the flame spirit. He would become pure fire, burning so hot and bright that his human form would be consumed entirely, leaving behind only the supernatural force that had been growing inside him for months. In short, Jake Morrison would cease to exist as anything recognizable, becoming a living manifestation of flame that could move through burning buildings but could never again touch another human being without destroying them. Chief Mackenzie found Jake in the parking lot, approaching with the careful movements of someone who was no longer entirely sure what his friend had become. Over the past 6 months, Mackenzie had watched Jake grow increasingly isolated, accepting fewer social invitations and avoiding physical contact with other people. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Jake was burning himself out from the inside just like his father and grandfather before him. "Jake, I know what you're thinking," Mackenzie said without preamble, "but there has to be another way. We can evacuate the building, set up defensive operations, limit the casualties without you going inside." 47 people will die if I don't go in there," Jake replied, his voice carrying undertones of combustion that made Mackenzie take an involuntary step backward. "I've seen it. Patients who can't be moved, staff who won't abandon them, families who get lost in the smoke. 47 people. And if you go in there, you'll die. Really die this time, not just transform." Jake looked at the burning hospital and saw the future spreading out before him with perfect clarity. Every victim he could save, every life that hung in the balance, every family that would be destroyed if he chose self-preservation over duty. Against that, he weighed his own existence, what was left of it after 6 months of gradual dehumanization. "I stopped being Jake Morrison the night of the Riverside fire," he said quietly. "What I am now, it's something between human and fire, and it's not sustainable. The flame spirit is consuming me piece by piece, and eventually there won't be anything left of the man I used to be." Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face in the morning light. The burns were more visible now, patterns of fire that moved beneath his skin like living tattoos. His eyes held flames that never went out, and when he breathed, small wisps of smoke emerged from his nostrils. "Your father made the same choice," Mackenzie said finally. "Walked into a fire that he knew would kill him because he couldn't live with letting people die when he had the power to save them. And he was right to make that choice, just like I'm right to make it now." Jake turned away from Mackenzie and walked toward the burning hospital, where the sound of sirens filled the air and emergency crews were setting up equipment for what would be the largest fire response in Millbrook's history. Engine companies from 6 neighbouring towns were converging on the scene, along with ambulances and medical helicopters that would transport the most seriously injured victims to trauma centres in Burlington and Boston. But all of that conventional emergency response would be inadequate without someone who could see through smoke, walk through flames, and guide rescues with supernatural precision. The hospital's layout was too complex, the fire was spreading too quickly, and there were too many people who needed help for normal firefighting techniques to save them all. Dr. Emily Foster was waiting for Jake at the emergency command post, her face grim with the knowledge of what the fire meant for the patients and staff trapped inside. Over the past 6 months, she'd watched Jake's transformation with growing concern, noting the way his body temperature had risen and his behaviour had become increasingly erratic. As a physician, she recognised symptoms of a condition that had no medical explanation or treatment. "Jake, thank God you're here," Emily said as he approached. "We've got critical patients on life support who can't be moved quickly, and the smoke is spreading faster than we can evacuate." "I know, I've seen it." Jake's voice was calm, resigned, carrying the authority of someone who had already accepted what needed to be done. "Emily, I need you to understand something. This fire is different from the others." "Different how?" "It's going to require everything I have. More than everything." Jake looked directly at her, and Emily saw flames dancing in his eyes like candles in a church. "I won't be coming out of that building." Emily felt her throat tighten with understanding. She'd suspected for months that Jake was suffering from some kind of progressive condition, something that was slowly consuming him from within. Now she realized that the condition wasn't killing him, it was transforming him into something that existed to fight fires, but couldn't survive outside of them. There has to be another way. Medical evacuation, helicopter rescues, something that doesn't require you to die? Jake smiled, and the expression was both heartbreaking and terrible. "Emily, I've been dying for 6 months. The thing inside me has been burning away everything that made me human, piece by piece. Tonight, I finally put it to good use." Jake reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped when he realized his hand was too hot to make contact with another person. The gesture was more poignant for its impossibility, a reminder of all the human connections he'd sacrificed to become something capable of walking through fire. "I want you to know that these past months, working with you, seeing your dedication to helping people, it's meant more to me than I can explain. You've reminded me what it means to be human, even as I was losing my humanity." Before Emily could respond, Jake turned and walked toward the burning hospital. He moved with purpose and finality, like someone going to meet an appointment that couldn't be postponed or avoided. The interior of Millbrook Regional Hospital was a maze of smoke and flame, filled with the sounds of collapsing ceiling tiles and the distant cries of trapped victims. Jake moved through it with the supernatural confidence that had become his trademark, but this time was different. This time he allowed the flame spirit to take complete control, surrendering the last remnants of his human consciousness to something larger and more terrible. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. Jake felt his physical form begin to dissolve as the flame spirit assumed direct manifestation, turning him into a being of pure fire that could move through any blaze without being harmed. His human senses were replaced by supernatural awareness that showed him every victim in the building, every path through the smoke, every weakness in the structure that could be exploited for rescue purposes. On the first floor, he found Dr. Patterson trying to evacuate patients from the intensive care unit. Jake appeared to him as a figure wreathed in flames, moving through smoke that parted like water around his supernatural form. Without speaking, Jake guided Patterson and his team to safety, leading them through corridors that were completely obscured by smoke but clear to his enhanced vision. On the second floor, Jake found a group of nurses who had refused to abandon their patients despite the evacuation order. He moved among them like a guardian angel made of fire, lifting patients who were too injured to walk and clearing paths through debris that blocked their escape routes. The nurses later described the rescue as miraculous, guided by someone who seemed to know exactly where to go and how to avoid the worst of the fire damage. On the third floor, Jake encountered families who'd been visiting patients when the fire started and were now trapped by smoke and flame. Children were crying with terror while their parents tried to find escape routes that didn't exist. Jake appeared to them as salvation, a figure of fire who somehow didn't burn them, who could carry them through flames that would have killed anyone else. But it was on the fourth floor that Jake found the confrontation he'd been expecting since the vision first appeared to him. In the center of what had once been the hospital's administrative wing, the flame spirit materialized in its original form, the tall figure made of fire that had spoken to him at the Riverside Apartments. "The time has come," the flame spirit said, its voice the sound of burning timber and collapsing walls. 3 generations of service, 3 generations of men who chose duty over life. Tonight, the pattern reaches its conclusion." Jake found himself standing in a circle of flames that reached from floor to ceiling, surrounded by destruction that somehow felt sacred rather than terrifying. His human form was already beginning to fade, consumed by the supernatural fire that had been growing inside him for months. "What happens after tonight?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You become what you were always meant to become, a permanent guardian, bound to this place and these people for as long as fires threaten them. No more visions, no more warnings, no more gradual consumption. You will be the fire itself, able to manifest wherever flames endanger innocent lives. And the cost? Jake Morrison ceases to exist as an individual consciousness. What remains will be something larger and more impersonal, a force of protection that serves the community, but no longer remembers what it was like to be human. Jake thought about Emily Foster waiting for him in the parking lot, about Chief Mackenzie and the volunteer fire department that had been his family, about the ordinary life he'd never really had but had always imagined he might find someday. All of that would end tonight, burned away to fuel something that could protect the community more effectively than any human firefighter. The 47 people who are trapped in this building, Jake said. Can you save them all? Together, we can save them all. But only if you surrender the last of your humanity to fuel the transformation. No half measures, no holding back pieces of yourself. Complete surrender. Jake closed his eyes and felt the weight of 3 generations of Morrison men who had made similar choices. His father, walking into a house fire that killed him because he couldn't let a family burn. His grandfather, spending his life fighting blazes that slowly consumed him from within. Dozens of other Morrison men stretching back through family history, all choosing service over survival, duty over personal happiness. I accept, Jake said, and felt his individual consciousness begin to dissolve into something larger and more terrible. The transformation was complete within minutes. Jake Morrison the man burned away entirely, his personality and memories consumed by the flame spirit that had been growing inside him since childhood. What emerged was something beyond human, a guardian made of fire and will, bound to protect Millbrook and its people for as long as they needed protection from flame. The rescue of the 47 trapped victims was accomplished with supernatural efficiency. The guardian that had once been Jake Morrison moved through the burning hospital like liquid fire, appearing wherever people needed rescue and disappearing once they were safe. Medical staff later described the evacuation as impossible. Too many people saved too quickly, guided through conditions that should have been fatal for anyone involved. When the sun rose over Millbrook Regional Hospital, the building was a total loss, but every single person had been evacuated safely. The official investigation would list the cause as electrical failure combined with unusually effective emergency response, though several witnesses reported seeing a figure made of fire moving through the building during the worst of the blaze. Chief Mackenzie stood in the hospital parking lot watching the cleanup efforts, knowing that he'd witnessed the end of the Morrison family legacy and the beginning of something new. Jake Morrison was gone, burned away to fuel a transformation that would protect the community for generations to come. Dr. Emily Foster found Mackenzie an hour after sunrise, both of them staring at the hospital ruins with the exhausted relief of people who had witnessed a disaster that could have been much worse. "He's really gone, isn't he?" Emily asked. Mackenzie nodded slowly. Jake Morrison died in that fire, but something else lives on, something that will keep watch over this place and make sure fires like this don't claim innocent lives. As if summoned by their conversation, they saw a flicker of movement in the hospital ruins, a brief glimpse of fire that moved against the wind, dancing among the debris with purpose and intelligence. It was too quick to be certain, but both Mackenzie and Emily felt watched, protected, by something that had once been human, but was now something larger. The Morrison legacy would continue, but it would no longer require the death of those who carried it. Jake had paid that price for all future generations, transforming from man to guardian, from individual to force of nature. In the month that followed, Millbrook experienced the safest fire season in its recorded history. Blazes that should have claimed lives were contained quickly, victims were rescued with miraculous efficiency, and the volunteer fire department developed a reputation for supernatural effectiveness that drew attention from emergency services throughout New England. And sometimes, when the fire calls came in at night, firefighters reported seeing a figure made of flame moving ahead of them through burning buildings, clearing paths and marking safe routes with an authority that could only belong to someone who had become fire itself. Jake Morrison had chosen to burn bright enough to light the way for everyone who came after him, and in doing so had become something that would protect his community forever.